Welcome, welcome, welcome. We have a number of people coming in, and as everybody is coming in, if you wouldn't mind making your cameras live. And we're excited to welcome everybody to today's CISO V Summit, Achieve Cyber Resilience, sponsored by Capgemini, into Cyber Resilience. And then we're going to have a discussion around a few key topics through resilience through Drew Moorfield from Capgemini. Jeff Pollard of Forrester is going to take us through a cyber resiliency survey and take us through the results. We're going to do a little bit of Q&A then in a roundtable. Like I said, I'm excited because we got such a wealth of experience and diversity of industry in the room today. So excited to see where that takes us. But for right now, I'm going to throw it over to Joe.
Thank you very much, JD. Appreciate it, and appreciate everybody's attendance today. So hopefully we can, as JD said, make this interactive and draw on each other's experience and expertise here, and really get some value out of this session. So before I get started, I wanted to take a second and just introduce everybody. Definitely excited today that we have Jeff Pollard from Forrester. He's a VP and the principal cyber analyst who really focuses on the role of the CISO, and I know he works with a lot of CIOs and really helps them set their strategy and develop some long-term plans. And definitely interested to hear some of his observations and get some of his stories in terms of what they're seeing out there. My name again is Joe McMahon. I lead strategy for Capgemini Cyber North America, and I work with a lot of our critical clients, just helping them implement and build solutions and mature and evolve over time. And I'm joined by my colleague Drew Moorfield, who's a VP and the head of the North American Cyber Center of Excellence for Capgemini North America. So with that, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And I just wanted to take a minute and set the table a little bit for what we wanted to talk about today. And here the topic of the topic du jour, let's say, is cyber resiliency. And really, what do we mean by that? It's easy to mash words before or after cyber and come up with a new concept. But for us, this is something that's really been around a long time. And I think it's something that is fundamentally important to all of our success together. And I've got two different ways to look at it. I think you could look at it at the tactical level. So think here, what are your network defense operations, your security operations like? What is your ability and capability to detect threats, to analyze those threats, to respond, and if you have to engage in some recovery, right? If you're suffering some event, attack, compromise, whatever the situation may be, down at that tactical level, what are your capabilities? But then also at the strategic level, right? If we think about changing business conditions, something that we've all experienced over the last 9, 10, 12 months, 100% without a doubt. But then it could be something too, just like mergers and acquisitions. It could be changes to how your business is operating on a day-to-day basis. So how do you, as a cybersecurity organization, keep moving forward in the face of all those moving challenges? And that's what we mean by resiliency. And I think there's a couple things to keep in mind, at least from our definition of this or our perspective of it. And one is that it's a mindset. So when we talk about cyber, a lot of us have been doing this for a long time, but I don't think there's anybody out there that knows everything there is to know about all of cyber. It's a really complex domain. And I think if we have the mindset that it's, there's all of these components, there's all of these piece parts, and they all need to work together in parallel and in concert, that's how we become resilient. That's how we become strong. From a strategic perspective, it's really balancing people, process, and technology. And I know that's a very common, triad, if you will, and everybody talks about it, but I can't stress the importance enough of achieving some level of balance. If you're over-invested in one particular area, our observation is that it's much harder to rebound, to move, to be flexible in terms of how you respond to whatever challenge or threat is coming down the pike. And then the last thing is the commitment to doing this the right way. This is not easy. This is hard. We've been doing this for a long time, and a lot of the same challenges seem to present themselves over and over again, maybe in new ways or in new styles. But the organizations that I personally have seen be most successful are those that built a strong foundation. It's those organizations that have really put the hard work in, and make no mistake, it is hard work to build the fundamentals, to build your organization and your capabilities up the right way. And that's what allows you to adopt a resilient posture. So in terms of what we wanted to get out of this session, what we partnered with Forrester to really try and answer, was thinking about this and how it influences your organizations. So the first thing we wanted to really understand is, where does resilience fit into your company's cybersecurity strategy? Is it a key objective that you're marching towards, or are you really just, in there's no shame in this, treading water, right? As some organizations are, because we're dealing with so many issues in front of us. But really, we're understanding where resilience fits. The second thing is, what are the components? What are the individual pieces that will influence your ability to achieve resilience? It could be technology, it could be your organization and your people, or it could be lack of processes, all of those types of things. But understanding what those components are is really important. And the third one that tends to generate a lot of conversation is, how do you measure the progress towards achieving resilience, towards achieving anything within cyber? The better we are at our jobs, the more quiet everything else is, the less we have to report on. So really figuring out how we measure what the risk is and how we've mitigated that risk tends to introduce some interesting conversation. The fourth thing is, obviously we've all been facing this challenge and facing it together, and really understanding how something like COVID and the pandemic response has influenced our overall strategy, how we're approaching resilience, not just what the challenges are, but what it means going forward. Where are those areas that we're all now going to invest in? As much as we'd like to, have this picture, and I'll date myself here, that we're all Scrooge McDuck doing a backstroke in a room full of gold coins, we know that's not reality, and we have to pick and choose where we invest. And so I'm really just, want to engender some conversation about, those areas that we think are going to give the highest return on that investment.
Capgemini's investment with and collaboration with Forrester, we wanted to do a bit more analysis and to dive a little deeper into what cyber resilience means across multiple enterprises or sectors that we support, and how can we look at it in a way to where not only we can provide more valuable support going forward, but we have the real pulse of the market. So without further ado, Jeff, I'll give it over to you, sir.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the awesome conversation so far, everyone. Too, by the way, it's interesting in these sessions to hear some of your feedback about what resilience means to you and what you're doing about it and how you're encountering it. And that's actually where we started off with the research that we were doing together with Capgemini, was really to start with the definition of cyber resilience. And then I'm going to go through that, some of the key insights from the research, and then we'll have some more Q&A and discussion. And as you have questions about anything I'm going through, feel free to toss them into chat, and we'll kind of, keep track of them and make sure we rip through them. But, for folks that have been in cybersecurity for all of an hour, because that's about how long it takes, I think one of the first things you'll find is that this is an industry that decides words can mean whatever we want them to mean. Because we've only been talking about pen testing now for 30 or 40 years, and it kind of turns out, depending on who you're talking to, it means about 12 different things, and they all have different budget amounts too. So one of the first things we want to do in the research is really start with the definition of cyber resilience, right? What exactly does it mean? And I know Joe walked through it earlier, but there's a couple of things in here that I like to highlight in terms of what we made sure to incorporate into the definition, and how I think I've heard some of that echoed so far. Because as I hear organizations talk about cyber resilience in particular, sometimes that means incident response, honestly. Sometimes that means recovery, right? So incident response and recovery. Sometimes it means, actual resilience, right? Factoring in your technology supply chain, your, physical supply chain, and, et cetera, right? It sort of varies on how comprehensive it is. And so we wanted to put, the definition that we have out there as part of the research, to really say that it's about your organization's ability to predict, resist, recover from, and adapt to really two types of adverse conditions, right? The first are all those kind of traditional cyber things that we think about. Joe and I have somewhat similar backgrounds in that we've been, sort of incident response, security operations, et cetera. So, we often think about attackers. But at the same time, what you're dealing with from a business perspective is that the changing business conditions you have to be resilient for as a company, as well as a cybersecurity program, are equally important. And those are things like new revenue streams, changing economic conditions. One of the things that I've noticed in my research over the past sort of 10 or 11 months or so in light of the pandemic is that we were all really aware of having a technology single point of failure, and sometimes even a human single point of failure, right? One person. There are a whole lot of businesses or business units that suddenly discovered that they had a revenue single point of failure, right? That the entire business model some of those organizations depended on required people to go somewhere or be somewhere or interact with people face to face or whatnot, right? If you're, you know, in financial services, people may not go to bank branches, right? So suddenly you had to be even more interactive from a customer engagement perspective. By the same token, there's other industries where people had to be face to face, right? I mentioned healthcare earlier as an example. So, you know, for all the effort that a lot of companies expended on the technology and even people side of single points of failure, there are also just some businesses that relied on a predominant sort of interaction pattern to create value that was disrupted immensely by the pandemic. And so resilience has to factor in both of those things, right? It has to really account for the fact that it's not just a security, a set of security capabilities. It's about what the organization does and how cybersecurity and resilience plays into that. And so once we kind of started with that as the foundation of this is the definition of resilience, we started to explore what it means to people and how it changes what they do and what they get out of that, right? So kind of the real meat of the of this from a definitional perspective. And you know, first and foremost, what we wanted to understand is how does cyber resilience influence the following, right? The following kind of items, and you know, then we ranked them based on, you know, how respondents answered the question. And what you'll see here is that the number one thing that's important from a sort of cyber resilience perspective and what it influences is the market and the customer's impression of brand. So it is business driven. To a few of the folks that talked about the fact that resilience was happening beforehand, that, you know, if anything, the pandemic might have accelerated some of your initiatives there. I think you're echoing what the other 215 respondents or what the 215 respondents in this survey talked about, right? Because what was really kind of number one for them was thinking about their market, the customer's impression of their brand. And that was something that was influencing cyber resilience, and cyber resilience was influencing that. And then the next two are what I would call the more sort of, you know, traditional cybersecurity things, right? The way that you perform security, so kind of the security operations, right, in the organization, and then the way that you respond to cyber threats, because obviously part of what does factor into resilience is remediation and recovery. It can also be policies and prevention, and we'll get into some of those things coming up soon. But you know, as you can see, cyber resilience is one of those things that it is multidimensional. It's affecting customers, it's affecting how cybersecurity does its day-to-day, and it's affecting how you respond to cyber threats and what you do about those. So it's highly influential, but it's influential beyond just the sort of silo of the security program. But we also wanted to find out, what are the barriers, right? Or how important are things to help you accomplish the goals that you have around cyber resilience? And maybe, I doubt it's going to surprise anyone, which to me is a good thing, because I think it sort of reaches out to the validity of the information we collected. But, you know, if you want to be resilient and you want to be comprehensive in the nature of your security program, you've got to have visibility across enterprises and applications, right? You've got to have situational awareness. You've got to have sunlight. You've got to understand what exists and what it's doing and how it works. But you've also got to be able to identify and measure risk. And this one, you know, this is one of those statements, really kind of both of them, but this one in particular, you know, we know how to measure things, we know how to quantify things, and we know how to identify things. But when you put all those words in the same sentence, we suddenly kind of don't know how to do any of those, because the ways that we try to quantify risk are incredibly challenging for a lot of organizations. They're arguably sometimes overconfident in that measurement. And often the decisions that they lead to aren't always the most optimal for the organization. This was also a problem, you know, before the pandemic, right? Before 2020, as was visibility, but they've certainly been exacerbated by things now. And then number 3 on the list, skilled and adaptive resources. And what I want to point out here about that particular point that I think is really important is that what we didn't say here, right, is headcount problems, right, staffing issues. This is really kind of focused on, you know, the skilled and adaptive resources that can help you facilitate cyber resiliency. And so that doesn't mean that it's a traditional set of cybersecurity skills, right, that practitioners usually have. Instead, this is really looking at it from the lens of do the people that work within your program have the skills and ability to adapt to facilitate cyber resilience. So I think that's an incredibly kind of interesting thing there to see that, you know, the way this is framed really isn't about, you know, headcount or staffing problems. It's about the actual skills and abilities of the individuals themselves, right? And their ability to kind of respond to that and ultimately help you accomplish the goals that you have around cyber resilience. Again, perhaps not surprisingly, but I think I heard what we've seen a lot in our conversations, which is the pandemic made this more challenging, but it didn't stop it, right? If anything, in some cases, it actually led buy-in, which we've heard from a lot of organizations that we've talked to so far, which is, you know, everyone agreed this was important and everyone wanted to do it. But we all live in a world of trade-offs and competing priorities. And, you know, time is always the thing that stops us from getting the most done. Well, all of a sudden, that issue got removed because we had to bring folks in to pick up their desktops and take them home, right? So everything had to be, you know, more resilient. So the pandemic didn't take away the focus on this at all. It certainly made it more challenging, and it certainly highlighted it as you know, one of those things that people wanted to do, which I think is interesting, because one of the real issues when the pandemic, you know, first started is we were, you know, kind of simultaneously rationing toilet paper and VPNs. And I don't know that any of us thought we'd be saying that in 2020, but we kind of were for a month or two, and you know, then suddenly, you know, the pandemic happened, and you know, some enterprises faced a lot of challenges. Obviously, it's been tough from a culture and mental health perspective for lots of people, but we've also had some businesses and teams thrive, right? They've been successful, or as successful as you can be. I call that out because we started collecting this data in sort of September and October. And I wanted to mention that because, you know, obviously the questions that you asked in March and the responses you get are really different than what you would get in April, right? Or May or June or July. Now it's December, and sometimes I think it's October, and sometimes I think that it's next year already. And sometimes I kind of want it to be right, because every day can be an hour or a minute. It feels like. But, you know, the most challenging aspects when you kind of look at resilience overall from an organizational perspective, you know, some of these are not brand new, right? Some of these things are certainly not new challenges in any way, shape, or form. The digital business growing too quickly to keep up, you know, that was a problem well before 2020. That was something that, you know, when I joined Forrester 5 years ago, you know, I was hearing about digital transformation already. So business models were changing. We have more code, we have more development resources, we have more apps in more places. We're pushing releases even faster every day, right? Especially as we adopt Agile as an example. So the digital business was already growing too quickly. But again, it's one of those things where if you were in the process of, you know, a little bit of a slower, you know, pivot, right? You know, if you were taking the ox is slow, but the earth is patient kind of model to this, well, you know, suddenly that's not going to work anymore. You got to go real fast. Well, COVID-19 changed the cyber landscape, because now instead of having 80% of our workforce, or maybe 50% of our workforce in 5 buildings or 10 buildings, depending on how big you are, you suddenly had them all in living rooms, and apartments, and, you know, bedrooms or whatever, where folks had to work from. So it certainly changed the defense that we have to do, right? The way that we're protecting things. And, you know, threats to the organization are more advanced today compared to 2019. And by the way, that's true, of course, right? Attackers are always improving. I mean, just 2 days ago, there's a remote code exploit for Microsoft Teams that's wormable, you know, right? I mean, it happens. So sure, someone could exploit that, or I could just get, you know, Samantha and, you know, Matthew or Felicia in accounting or whatever to just click on a link or just use a password for, 2 streaming platforms and their enterprise email, right? So I can be advanced or not. I don't have to be. So even though threats are more advanced today than they were in 2019, they also don't have to be to get in. So those are the things that are kind of challenging, resilience and moving forward with resilience when you think about it. And like I said, the pandemic has exacerbated these, but what our respondents showed us is that it certainly hasn't introduced completely brand new ones. It's just made the things that were already there a little more difficult. And, in response, what we found is that security is not going away. Now, depending on your industry and your region, certainly some folks have been rocked by this. I tell the story about a company that I've worked closely with through the years here at Forrester. They're a gaming company, right? So gambling. Their business model was literally gone. I mean, it disappeared. They didn't have much online gaming, right? They had locations in Macau and Vegas and other places. And the CFO came to the CISO and said, look, we've got to save money. We're going to have to outsource and offshore. And we're going to have to let people go. And we need you to kind of guide us through that and do it the best way that we can. And, he came to me and he said, look, I want help to explain why this isn't the right decision and why security is going to become more challenging, et cetera. And I said, look, I got to be honest. I can't do that. Your company is struggling to survive, literally. I mean, we're talking about an extinction event for your business. I agree there's challenges with doing that model sometimes. What you've got to do is find a way to get everyone that works for you a job ASAP and facilitate this transition and do it the best way you can. So that way you prove that you're a real executive, because that's the decision that they're being faced with. So 75% of our respondents said that, cybersecurity budgets had increased. That's not true all the time, but it's certainly true for most organizations out there. And that's because they had to go out and buy, more software, more technology in a lot of cases, right? They needed more VPN licenses, or maybe they needed more WAF licenses. So cybersecurity budgets have gone up, and that's expected to continue in 2021. But also revenue streams have changed, and that's had an effect on cybersecurity. The applications that you have, the things that you do that are customer facing, you've now got to secure those because they're even more important. A reliance on outsourced support, right? Turning to kind of expertise on demand, because headcount isn't a permanent solution right now for a lot of companies. And you'll see that's actually why we included the choice down there about increased headcount for cybersecurity, because that wasn't the thing that a lot of companies did. It just wasn't feasible. One, there are obviously, cost implications for that. But also, introducing new people to the organization isn't easy. Arguably, there's a little bit of a friction that every new person you bring in introduces. And so if they don't know your environment, if they don't know the culture, if they're not trained, then it can be really hard to bring new people in. They may not solve problems right away, right? Most people kind of say, and the old sort of fable out there is it takes about a year for someone to become productive. And I think that's true. So, we saw services increase. We saw the sort of digital transformation, if you will, become even more important. And we saw budgets uplift as a result of that, as folks grappled with it. Now, the ways that those budgets kind of increased, or the impact that those things had, when you look at, what happened in terms of kind of security operations and some of the programmatic elements, organizations added more security features. Like I mentioned, if you're suddenly relying on even more applications, maybe than you were before from a customer experience perspective, well, what if you had 10 WAF licenses and now you need 20? Or what if you had a threshold of X and you need to upgrade that to Y? So in some cases, it was adding licensing capacity. In others, it was adding to your security catalog and your security capabilities. So doing more as a security program to help secure the way the company's operating. I'll say one that we've heard from everyone, which is why it's high on this list, but also in these conversations, is data security became hyper important. Maybe not surprising because of the explosion of EDR, or really the explosion of kind of endpoint, right? Not so much EDR, but the explosion of endpoint. Now you have data everywhere. You have people that are literally working on BYOD devices so that they can do their job. And so if you had policies against it, then they went away, right? They kind of vanished overnight. And then, you'll forgive me for these next two. I know it's already come up a little bit. I'm not an identity person. I've typically run from that screaming throughout my career. But, number 3 and number 4 on this list in terms of how it changed things for people were identity policies and identity management. And that isn't surprising. First of all, you had a remote workforce out there that you suddenly had to get into, the enterprise, but you've also got customer identity and access management concerns because your customers might be interacting with you differently. It's funny, before I joined Forrester, because I hadn't worked in IAM at all ever in my career, I sort of thought it was a solved problem, right? I'm like, well, we've got MFA and we've got SSO, so this is fixed, right? Well, at Forrester, one of my colleagues, Andras Chair, he's been here for about 13, 14 years now. Andras is literally, and this isn't hyperbole at all, the busiest analyst at Forrester. He writes more reports than anyone. He does more inquiries. He does more advisory. He is quantitatively the busiest analyst we have. And he's one identity analyst. We have another one because he's so busy. So we have another guy, Sean Ryan, who covers it, right? So identity was hard. I didn't know that before I joined Forrester. Now I do, and I still run from it. But this became a huge issue throughout 2020 to allow connectivity and again to change the way that potentially you're interacting with customers. So when we get to that part, if there is any Q&A over that, and there probably will be because Drew, Joe, and I have noticed that. I'm going to ask everyone that's attending to make sure to save me from it. Right? Please don't force me to answer. I'll certainly try to tap dance, but I don't think anybody wants to see that atrocity happen in front of them. So help me out a little bit. Companies are going to keep investing in cyber resilience. 66% of the respondents that took a survey said that they were likely to invest or increase their investment in cyber resilience over the next 12 months. So if they weren't doing it before, they're going to. If they were already doing it, they're increasing the budget amounts related to that. Given the last couple slides, it may not shock you to know that some of those budget amounts wind up in areas like data security. Also a lot in identity. In fact, I think that was some of our liveliest conversation and in one of our sessions was about the budget and the process of IAM and how that had changed. So we've certainly seen that. And by the way, this is true across verticals as well. So JD mentioned some of the verticals that we have folks, attending from, 65% in kind of manufacturing, automotive, life sciences and others, 70% of telecom, media and high tech, 65% across energy, utility, chemicals, 62% around FinServ. That's the kind of vertical breakout for the plans to invest or the increase investment within cyber resiliency. So, you're probably here because this is something that you were either intrigued by and planned on or were already doing. So one, that's good because if you're not, everyone else is, which means you'll have to play some catch up. If you've been doing it, the good news is folks are following you. It means you can certainly get some excellent peer insight and some help with it. But it also means that you might be ahead too, right? You might have been a little out in front of this, which is not something that every security leader can say all the time, right? We're certainly a little reactive sometimes, and being out in front of it is never going to be a bad thing. So it really doesn't matter, what industry you focus on. Resiliency is a priority in many of them, and at very high levels, right? Kind of more than 60% sort of across the board. But when you look at what you're going to get out of resilience, this is absolutely 100% my favorite chunk of data that we collected in the survey. Not saying I don't love the other stuff, right? I've got 4 kids and they're all my favorite. It just kind of depends on what they're doing at the moment as to how favorite they are. But this is, without a doubt, right? I'll say I'm going to play favoritism a little bit with this slide. This is definitely the favorite, and here's why. And I'm going to use a couple of kind of pseudo marketing cliches. So forgive me when I do. It'll hopefully be the only time I do it, but there's a little bit of a virtuous cycle here, right? Or the other one that I've avoided trying to use, but it's like a 1 + 1 = 3. And again, I promise no more. But when you look at what people expect to get out of those investments, right? So the benefits that they want to obtain from the investments that they're making, well, as I go through each one of these, what you're going to see is how much they feed into each other, right? How the marginal benefit of each one of these is greater than the one before, right? There's really not a diminishing return with these, which again is not something we can often say. So let's take a look at it, right? 74% of respondents said that, one of the kind of benefits that they expected to get out of investments in cyber resiliency was increased collaboration. I think that one's incredibly intriguing. One of the things that I heard a lot in the early days of the pandemic is how many organizations learned that their culture and their collaboration was dependent on sitting close to people. They had good security teams, they had good security cultures, but it was because you couldn't get too mad at, the person that you were, trying to solve a problem with when they were 3 desks away. But when we're all sort of little Brady Bunch pictures or people in Slack or Teams or whatever, it's real easy to get mad at each other. I've certainly sent some IMs that I probably shouldn't have. And so a lot of companies learned that part of what was giving them that culture was the fact that everyone was close to each other, the fact that the people were seeing each other every day. And what do you do when that isn't the case anymore? So that increased collaboration is a huge benefit because we absolutely need it. But, next up after that, 69% of respondents said increased security incident readiness response or remediation, right? So they'd be able to they'd be more ready and better equipped to respond and remediate cybersecurity incidents. Now, I'm always curious if anyone disagrees, but I would say that, if you have increased collaboration within the security org, then I'm almost, I don't like to gamble, but I'd be willing to bet that if you're really good at collaboration, you're also more ready and more able and equipped to respond and remediate, right? Because your team communicates better. They connect faster, right? They're going to have a higher velocity. And then number 3, 67% said better integration among people, process, and technology within security. Well, again, I'm going to argue that if you're good at collaborating and you're prepared and able to respond and remediate, that you probably have really good integration across people, process, and technology. And by the way, if you achieve better integration with people, process, and technology, you're probably better at collaborating. You're probably better at being ready and responding and remediating things. So each of these feeds into each other. And when we think about a lot of our security investments, expense in depth is a Forrester term that we use a lot here. Not defense in depth, but expense in depth. And the example I always use is kind of threat intel. You're buying threat intel in a SIM, you're buying threat intel in an endpoint, you're buying threat intel in a proxy, and I won't pick on threat intel too much, but you're buying 4 or 5 threat intels, right? When you think about it, well, how many of those do you need? I mean, do you need 5 threat intels or would just one be okay, right? That's an example of expense in depth where you have overlapping controls. And so there's a real diminishing return whenever you've got that. Well, these are things that are the exact opposite, right? If you make these investments in cyber resiliency, the benefits that you should expect and can expect to get out of them are things that all feed into each other and make the security culture better, but also just better prepared to address what the company needs you to address. So anyway, as you can tell, I talk fast in general. Sorry about that. I talk even faster when I get excited, and that's why if I was already at a few hundred words per minute, it definitely ticked up. I don't know if Drew and Joe are counting to make fun of me, but sometimes they do that. So if you need any of that repeated, let me know. We'll do that when we get into the next section. But just to kind of put a little bit of a point on it here, when you think about the overall sort of key takeaways, we know that cyber resilience influences business decisions, right? There are key business drivers as a part of it. Cyber resilience requires visibility. It requires defined goals, and it also requires, awareness and ability to sort of quantify risk to the best extent possible. COVID certainly made it more challenging. But it also exacerbated things that were already in process. So some of this was just reacting as quickly as possible to things that you already knew were happening. And then there's an opportunity here as well. The focus on security certainly hasn't lessened; it's only increased. And investments in cyber resiliency will kind of be multiplied in terms of what they give back to you organizationally from a benefit perspective. So that's, basically the gist of kind of what we asked in the survey, what we covered, what the 215 or so respondents that we had in this data set shared with us. That's going to be my portion. So if I've, successfully thrown more words at you than you expected, I certainly apologize. There is a reckoning coming. We have been in sort of almost 12-ish years of growth mode for cyber budgets based on us going back and looking at our data. And that's all the way back to 2008, because the thing about budgets then, even if you go back to sort of the crisis in 08, is that there were a number of companies that disappeared. and then some companies didn't. But cyber was such a small part of budgets then that we kind of made it through almost unscathed, depending on the sector you were in. But cyber kind of skated through a little bit. I don't think that's going to happen moving forward. I think you're absolutely right. The number one question when I talk to CISOs about going in front of the board right now, I get two questions. They line up exactly with what you said. One, how can I better express efficacy, right? Or what is the right set of metrics to express that? With maturity being a set that we often recommend as kind of a starter pack, if you will. And the other one is, I've gotten more budget, and I haven't always gotten what I wanted when I've asked for money, but I've always gotten what I needed. And I was very comfortable making that distinction. Now they're starting to ask me, what did you do with all that money? And I've done stuff, right? I've done things, clearly. But I need to be able to talk about what the benefit or the value of those things are. And it's not a simple business case, or it's not as simple as a business case in all times. I think that pressure is going to increase. I don't know that budgets will go down, though, because here's the looming problem out there. Every single issue that we have from a cybersecurity perspective is getting worse. And here's what I mean by that. Cyber's gotten way better. There's no doubt about that. I mean, we're so much better off today than we were a year and a half ago. And that's certainly true. But look, we've got edge computing coming. We've got 5G that's kind of here, but not really. We've got IoT that's been around for a while. So if you are struggling with, alert fatigue because of the logs that you had before, well, I got news, right? Logs, you're not getting fewer logs anymore. If you were struggling with collecting telemetry because you had so many devices in the environment, well, you're about to have more. Like, every toilet's going to have an IP address if it doesn't already. Every thermostat's going to have one. Your company's going to make products that have those as well. So the reason why I see cyber continuing to grow is that the complexity of the connectivity that we operate within from a business perspective and an infrastructure perspective is only getting worse. But at the same time, what we're going to have to do is be able to articulate better the value of the things that we've done, because you're not going to be able to get it just because you ask for it anymore. And I know that was a really long answer, but there's a lot of context there behind what you're asking. But I do think you're right. I think to a certain extent, there is a reckoning. It doesn't mean your budget gets slashed. It just means it gets harder for you, and you've got to become more savvy at articulating it.
Yeah, right. We rarely get to have that ROI discussion from a cyber investment perspective, but business value, it doesn't always have to be measured by risk reduction per se, which is the first expectation. That's fundamental. How else do you see that showing up, or what are recommendations, guidance you could provide as far as how to define business value as a derivative from cyber investment? Anything that you've seen really, convert well at the enterprise level?
Yeah, so we've got a couple things that we talk about, and I'm curious as to if anyone else has any examples, because this is always really fun to explore how companies are doing it. The first is Paul Mackay and I, one of my colleagues in the UK, have a model that's based on impact on maturity. I'm skeptical of return on investment from a security perspective, and I'm perhaps even more skeptical of ROCE from a return on security investment perspective, because if it has a sigma in it, I start to worry if it's true. But what Paul and I did is we put together a model that effectively looks at your current maturity and your expected maturity after you make an investment, and effectively says, based on what you're spending on this is your impact on maturity, right? The sort of expectation you can get. And we've worked with a lot of clients on that, and they like it because if you're framing the overall security program in terms of maturity, then why not also frame your investments in terms of maturity? So that's definitely one. And then the other one, and this is one that I lead some of our emerging trends and topics research from a security and risk perspective here at Forrester. And I often call product security the cheat code for business relevance. I'm a gamer, and securing the products and services that you sell, right? The customer facing things that make you money. If you can find a mechanism to articulate your security investments in terms of their contribution to the security and protection of those customer facing products and services, that's how you become hyper relevant, because you're talking about the things that your company makes money. And so if you are directly linked to those from a cybersecurity perspective, I don't want to say it becomes easy because it's not easy to do, but it simplifies that battle of articulating business relevance. So, you know, that impact on maturity or using maturity as well as product security are two sort of super common ways that I've seen it. Drew, Joe, and others, I'm curious what everyone else's experience is.
Joe, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is, I mean, to go back to the original question, even, it's definitely interesting, Nick. You know, anecdotally, and that's where I can give our observations. I don't have quite the scientific research arm that Forrester does, but it's been just in my own journey. It's been interesting. You know, starting with the defense contractors in the early 2000s, everybody decided at that point in time they wanted to be the best, right, in their industry. They wanted to be the shining example of what awesomeness cyber could be. And budgets absolutely exploded in the 2000s up into the teens. And that was obviously corresponding to a lot of the threats that were becoming much more readily apparent outside of government and down, you know, driving down into commercial in terms of some of the more advanced activity, let's say. And so that drove spending. And now I think what we're seeing driving spending is a lot of the issues that Jeff raised, the technical challenges, the all of those types of things. And what has been really interesting to me is the objective, right? It's not to be the best anymore, it's to be good enough, right? And how do you define what is enough? And I think we have a floor, and your floor is oftentimes based on your industry. It might be based on your GRC practices, what regulations you have to adhere to, what compliance frameworks you have to adopt. You know, if you're going to adopt and adhere to NIST or ISO, that sometimes is your floor. But then how far above that do you need to be until where your investment or your efficacy is, as Jeff was talking about, or your maturity starts to tail off? And I think that's something that, you know, we've definitely tried to help some clients with. I've seen some interesting takes on it. We were working with a large chemical company who did take the NIST framework, and he basically distilled it down a little bit, you know, took it down a level in terms of detail so that his executive team could understand it, and then did exactly what Jeff was talking about, started to map some of his investments to showing how he could move. I think he did a 5-point scale, so he could show where he was moving along the maturity curve at each core component of NIST over the years by investing in certain areas. So he wasn't able to quantify the investment, but he was at least able to visually depict it and show it. And so that was a really interesting way to do it. I don't know, Nick, that it made it any more predictable, because that's one of the issues with cyber is we're responding to external stimuli, right? I'd love to say we know what the bad guys are going to do, or we know what the vulnerabilities are going to be, but we don't. So that, you know, that's one of the big issues, I think, in terms of being predictive when it comes to the budget. But curious what everybody else is doing.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think we also see at the same time an easier way of identifying and perhaps even solving for diminishing level of return through hyper growth and investment, through autonomy within the business, through accelerated merger and acquisition activity, certain areas that require better interoperability or you know, material consolidation of the technology landscape within an environment. And by doing so, perhaps elevating or increasing the visibility. Greg, we were talking earlier about a story specific or embodying, if you will, how cyber resilience can be demonstrated or executed. Wondering if you'd be willing to provide your perspective there.
Sure. My perspective here is really specific to the industrial control system world, but talking to visibility in the specifically, this is for a natural gas producer. And this natural gas producer had very solid cyber maturity on the enterprise. And on the enterprise, everything was great. They had good visibility. Their operations center was being managed effectively and efficiently. But as soon as they moved down into the process where the actual plants are actually pulling the natural gas out of the ground, processing it, and then sending it off to their customers, it was a giant black hole. So we were able to actually tie two different vendor solutions together into a unique solution where the sum of the two are greater than the sum of the two parts, and in order to bring visibility from a cyber specific perspective into basically what has up until then been a big giant unknown, a big giant question mark. Similarly, there's a manufacturing company that we've been working with where and this is a different angle of cyber resiliency, where it's more about preemptively minimizing the damage. And this is more on the lines of, in their manufacturing facilities, and they had many plants around the world, their plant was wide open in the sense that it was a flat network. So there was no segmentation in place. We introduced a lot of network segmentation to them to minimize the impact of a potential breach. And basically they were beginning to walk down that, and continue, because it's a long journey to walk down that zero trust path. And I think between the two, between the visibility, network segmentation, identity and access management is undoubtedly coming up shortly with both of these organizations. Those are just a couple of examples that I've worked with recently.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Greg. Appreciate the feedback. What you'd like to make there?
Yeah, I think currently a couple of colleagues are actually doing some research on that with some risk quantification waves, as a matter of fact. So Paul Mackay and Ala Valente are doing some research on that right now. You know, it's one of those things. Tons of people talk to me about it. It's one of the more common topics that often comes up from sort of a risk quantification perspective. I think they run into a few obstacles. One, they don't have all the visibility they need, right? Which makes the quantification problematic. Two, they run into a situation where there are a lot of situations where things promise to be quantitative, but in reality, there's something qualitative in the estimate, right? And that automatically sort of erodes, or at least it impacts the overall sort of number that you're throwing out. And then I think one of the biggest challenges that security leaders have when they share those numbers externally, and sometimes the problem they have even when they talk about it themselves, is that risk quantification can give you a certainty that doesn't actually exist, right? Because it's a number. And so once it's a number, people believe it. And when you are talking about that number comes across as the authority. And the problem is the methodology behind the number, the assumptions that were made, some of those qualitative aspects, the confidence factor, et cetera, the unknown unknowns, the known unknowns, whatever, all that stuff factors into that. And so you start to give the illusion of certainty. The example I often use is about 3 or 4 years ago, when more organizations started using maturity with the board, which we were advocating for as well. One of the common sort of pieces of feedback I got is like, well, I shared maturity and now the board thinks that's a measure of our health. Right. But it's not. It's a measure of, where you are on the scale that's linked to some various types of functions or categories like people, process, technology, and oversight. If you're a 3 or a 3.4 on a 5-point scale, the argument that one of those maturity levels is more healthy than the other, that's a real sketchy argument to make, right? There's a lot of ways that number could be a 3 or a 3.4. So when I see risk quant, there's a lot of input problems, there's a lot of visibility problems, but then there's also just a lot of messaging and almost branding and marketing problems in terms of how you leverage that number that can get security leaders in a whole lot of trouble when they try to use it.
Yeah, no, very much. We, as mentioned earlier, we're seeing organizations across all verticals trying to synthesize that level of risk with posture, and ultimately trying to get some balance in between. And it's an ongoing challenge or mission and objective. It's, unfortunately, it's not a point in time measurement, as we all know. So thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. Yoram, you mentioned 3 main focal points being around cyber resilience, really shifting to vendor management or vendor optimization, vendor consolidation, potentially identity management, and endpoint. Certainly agree at a macro level that those are 3 areas of focus, prioritization, and increased execution, right, on that spending. Identity access management specifically is something that's taking new shape, or perhaps even new opportunity and complexity with the threat surface or the attack surface changing, and the shift to work from home, let alone bad actors in the space that we've been defending against for some time. Any comment?
Let me jump in real quick before Jeff does, because I know he wants to say something about it. Yoram, you make a really good point, and there's definitely it means something different to a lot of people, and it's definitely become, I think, taken over by the vendor space in terms of what zero trust is. But like you said, you're a security person. You've always operated with that mantra of trust nobody. And I think that makes sense. And, you know, as a network defender, I always want to know, where can I exert control, right? Where can I impact this transaction, regardless of what that transaction is, whether it's an authentication of an individual, whether it's instantiation of a service, whether it's a TCP IP transaction, right? Where can I get visibility into it, and where can I exert some sort of control upon that? And I think, you know, the interesting thing that we're all seeing when you ask the question about IAM and endpoint, it's, you know, partly been obviously accelerated by COVID, and we talked about it at the very beginning of the call, everybody shifting to a more remote workforce. It's this death of the perimeter that's been happening for at least 10 years, as far as I've heard about it. You know, it's the shift to cloud environments, and we were talking earlier about, you know, the fact that everything's really controlled now through APIs. But as I look at it, as the traditional enterprise does start to shift and change a little bit, you know, I think you're starting to see those areas rise up, because those are the places we can exert control as network defenders, as security engineers. I can control who has access. I can control what their privileges are. I can control the rights they have to certain data sets, and I can control what happens on the host. A lot of other times, I've lost control over what happens in a cloud environment. That's somebody else's application, somebody else's service, and somebody else's infrastructure at that point. You know, I've lost control over what happens as the bits are flying across the web, and part of that's just because of things like encryption. I don't have the visibility or control into that anymore, and so I think you're starting to see IAM and endpoint and those things rise up, because that's where we can do our work now. So with that said, Jeff, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
You know, we're seeing, you know, we've seen for you know, a number of years now, a lot of interest in zero trust and deployment. I think the major shift around zero trust that I think we've hit on in some of these conversations is really that, you know, zero trust went in the early days from being something that was often thought of as a segmentation mechanism at the network level, and that's not gone, of course. But I think the thing that is now most prevalent is really thinking about zero trust from an identity perspective. And I don't just mean human identity, right? I mean identity across the enterprise, because that's really how things are happening now, right? It's not just people that are accessing things, it's machine to machine capabilities via automation or even API integrations or microservices. So, you know, the idea of zero trust being sort of a human-centric thing is both true, but it's also expanded quite a bit beyond that. And when you think about the expansion of, again, sensors and APIs and devices and data, et cetera, it becomes one of those things where you can't manually facilitate all of that, right? And that's where zero trust comes in.
Sorry, Jeff. Yeah, it's, you know, I knew it was a broader discussion, but it's always interesting to see, you know, it's never a binary, it's rarely a binary thing. So, you know, how you can deploy or apply different aspects of a strategy or an approach or a methodology. I think it's, you know, we're all forced now to look at things on how do we get certain nuggets and make them applicable, or how does that enrich or elevate my security posture and support the mission or needs of the business. So
Yep.
Appreciate your feedback, and your Rom, certainly thank you for your question and context. Joe, I want to shift to you for a moment and speak to, you know, our UED approach and how we find that to be highly relevant in today's market.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Drew. And I want to take a quick second too, just to thank everybody for their participation in the conversation. I thought it was awesome. It's always really refreshing to hear the realities that everybody's faced with, not the vendor pitch, but the things that each of you are doing on a day-to-day basis. And you know, to that end, I think, you know, based on some of the discussions we've seen today, as well as some of the discussions we've had over the last week or two in sessions similar to this, I know we're interested in kind of keeping these conversations going and potentially setting up some more regular cadence, so that you know, individuals like yourselves have the opportunity to talk through some of this and hear what each other's doing. So look for some emails on that. If anybody's specifically interested in participating in more of that, feel free to throw your name in the chat. And we'll definitely try and get those set up and keep this conversation going, because I think it's awesome. as we move into it, and as we've talked through today, that there's a lot of different things that we're all struggling with, whether it's whether it's building the long-term strategy, whether it's figuring out which particular components we need to evolve and mature, whether it's figuring out how to and where to invest, or how to measure the return on that investment. I think there's a lot of things that we're all trying to tackle, and we're all trying to move forward. The shameless plug here is that this is near and dear to our heart in Capgemini Security. There's nothing we really like to do more than help customers overcome these challenges, mature and evolve their operations as a long-term strategic partner. So we work with a large chunk of the Fortune 500 and Global 2000 to help do this, and we can bring a lot of these experiences to bear. There's really no substitute for having been there and done that, and had hands-on and working with individuals like yourselves, and really learning from you, and taking those lessons learned out to the rest of the community. So if it's something you're interested in hearing more about, if you need help with anything, we're here. Definitely let us know. Our contact information is the bottom right of the slide. And I'll hand it back to Drew, but I wanted to say thank you again to everybody. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you as well, echo your comments. We wanted to make sure this was not only relevant but content rich, and I think the more interaction, the more we can round out some of that discussion, and hopefully it provided some thought-provoking detail that you can massage and try to operationalize on a go-forward basis. As Joe indicated, we're going to look to do more of this on a go-forward basis. So from a collaboration and interest perspective, if you're interested, please let that be known, and we'll be responsive to that.